ever considered producing courseware on economics? I faintly remember Curt saying he found learning economics more difficult than physics, which I can heavily relate to. When I'm learning about Newton's laws, I know there's no question whether it's true. In economics, there are Nobel Prize winners who says obviously ridiculous things. Curt has mentioned that it's too difficult to keep up with and debunk even every lie Paul Krugman spews, for instance. Curt heavily recommends books like Economics in One Lesson, yep, plus one on that. And then you have Martin dunking on libertarian and Austrian economics. As someone who wants to be multidisciplinary, it is hard to teach myself economics while having to constantly discern truths from falsehood. If you aren't planning on recording courseware on economics, do you have any advice on how to navigate the landscapes of fields of economics and figure out what is right and wrong?
We went over this a bit 2 sessions ago. For now, I'm not telling you to not read Austrians. If you need to learn the basics like what is marginal utility and so on, you go do that. But then when you want to understand how it works in the real world, I suggest you check out Friedrich List, Ian Fletcher, and Michael. As for the course, until and unless we get around to economics course, you can probably get what you're looking for from Academic Agents Foundations of Economics, which I assume mostly covers the Austrians too. Just be aware that it's rather pricey.
Smart. Very clear analysis. Okay, I'm going to repeat a couple of things and repeat a couple of things. First, I'm interested in behavioral economics. In other words, I want to know what the economics of human behavior and how that in other words, that's the first principles, right? So there are two wings of the Austrians, the European wing and the Jewish wing. The European wing's been fully integrated into economics. In other words, Austrian economics is just economics. The Jewish wing of it, which is the Mises, Rothbard, Hayek, anarcho-capitalist wing of it is like many things. It's like why did we have to invent classical liberalism when it was just liberalism? It's because the liberals the left stole the title liberal. The same thing has to do with Austrian economics. For all intents and purposes, modern economics, which is the study of marginalism and the application of marginalism as a means of explaining human behavior, is the Austrian invention. Everybody else is a product of that invention. Not everybody else is a product of Jewish Austrian economics. Now, at the time this was thought of, it has been suppressed now aggressively, like most things. But there was a clear debate in Europe over what were called Jewish economics, Jewish physics, and Jewish sociology. And that is because there was something profoundly different between the Jewish interpretation and an attempt to make a science in those fields and the European attempt to make a science in those fields. Now, much of my work, or our work, is actually exposing why that is, as the origins of the masculine and feminine forms of cognition and group evolutionary strategies. At the time, they didn't know why it was. At present, we do know why it is. So when Martin says, I'm not telling you not to read the Austrians, he's correct. But on the other hand, once you understand that the Austrians are fully integrated into mainstream economics today, even if the Jewish Austrians are not, in other words, if the European Austrians are fully integrated, even if the Jewish Austrians are not, then what you discover is that what you discover is that it's just economics. The difference, I think, that is, which is what I repeat frequently, is that when you look at the Austrian economics, you are looking at the attempt to discover behavioral economics. In other words, the economics of human behavior. That's why I focus on economics in one lesson, the work of Gary Stanley Becker, because that's how I process economics, as the foundations, the first principles of resulting economic behavior. If you get past that, now you're into what's called the Chicago School. The Chicago School of Economics, so you have the Austrian School, which is foundations of human behavior. If you get into the Chicago School, you're talking about ensuring against variability in human behavior. And so that's what the Chicago School tries to do. And if you get into this, we call the Chicago and Freshwater School, are the name, Chicago School and Freshwater School. The New York and Saltwater School of Economics is the one we most associate with Keynesian, New Keynesian economics, which is government manipulation of the economy to maximize consumption and growth at the expense of risk. So when you say, I'm going to study economics, what do you want to study? You study first principles, which is behavioral economics. Do you study how to insure people, which is basically Milton Friedman and the Friedmanites in the Chicago School, which is things like, yeah, we do want to subsidize education, but in order to preserve the market computation, another cause and effect relationship, and prevent the bad things, we should use vouchers. And then you have the Saltwater School, which is where all the bad stuff really comes from, which is it's just, the Paul Krugmans of the world, whatever, which is really the attempt to centralize power in a state, the same way women try to centralize power for their control. And it's the opposite of the libertarian or the classical liberal view. I'm a classical liberal, which is to maximize the use of the market, and wherever the market is weak, provide either insurance, as in the Chicago School, or provide means of correction, which is in the Saltwater School. The means of correction, as Keynes originally meant it, was don't do this stuff unless you're trying to get out of a depression. What happened was that turned in, here's how to maximize growth by continually manipulating the economy with essentially disinformation, and especially monetary disinformation, and spending disinformation. That experiment ended when the Austrians were proven right in 2008 that you cannot perpetually kick the can down the road, because you cannot perpetually depend on growth. And so that was the end of the Keynesian, New Keynesian experiment over time. So we've been in a period now where we're a little closer to the Chicago School, and because we're trying to get out of the trap we've made with the Keynesian, New Keynesian schools. They like to debate me on this. In other words, before I switched over to law, I was devoting most of my energy to economic reform instead of legal reform. Like Hayek, I came to understand the problem isn't economics. The problem is the law that limits the behavior of people within an economy from doing bad things. It doesn't mean it does. So in other words, economics is a nice via positiva, but the incentive to do bad with it is too high without the law to limit what can be done with it, so that the bads can't be done with it. So I would say, I don't say, while I say I learned everything important from Austrian economics, that has to do with my interest in the unification of neuroscience or computation, right? The theory of incentives behavior, behavioral economics as the science of behavior. In other words, how to measure it through demonstrated behavior, because psychology failed, and then the application of behavioral economics to the law, so that we limit the misuse of economics. So I have a sort of via negativa, what's called a falsificationary science view of these disciplines. If you want to know, if I would recommend that you look at it like that: behavioral economics, insurance economics, which is Chicago school, and abusive economics. That's the top level macro view of the study of economics. However, Martin goes into this, and he's saying, yeah, okay, so now if you have that understanding, you can go to List, Fletcher, Hudson in particular. I think Hudson's probably great, but the truth is, you can read any mainstream. Greg Mankiewicz's Intro to Economics, his books. You can read the books by Krugman. The ones that are used to teach in university. At one point, I can't remember what year it was in the 2000 somewhere. I just bought them all and I read them all, and I'm like, well, they're not really that different. All the introductory books are great. It's not the understanding of economics that's a problem. It's the abuse of it by political systems and the deception of people under the false promise of endless growth. That there isn't an equilibration that happens everywhere in the universe at all times. It just depends upon how long it takes for the equilibration to take place. There's no difference between a set of physical molecules or particles in the universe and human beings, except that we know how to take advantage of time to alter the course of things for our benefit. But when we try to, as Martin doesn't like it when I say violate, when we try to circumvent the laws of nature, what happens is we incur a debt that we have to pay, that we eventually will pay back, because all forces equilibrate. So if you understand at the macro level what I'm saying, and you understand that what Martin is saying here, which is where to go about it. And I haven't seen Academics Agents course, but I assume if Martin has reviewed it, that it's absolutely worth the effort.
I haven't done it because, again, it's very costly, but I'm very familiar with him.
Yes.
So I assume it must be good.
Yes. I consider him a net contributor.
He's a former libertarian. So
yes.
Something that's all about Austrian
It's good
economy.
to be a former libertarian, isn't it, Martin?
Yeah, and then he figured out it doesn't really work like that. That people are tribal and need authority in their lives.
Right. So I need so I think when you're looking at we haven't answered the question yet, but I think when you're looking at the Institute, or especially my effect on the Institute, I'm a Hayekian. That means economics is only meaningful in the description of human behavior across the scale, and a model that is, in other words, physics is as a temporal description of what happens. Economics is an intertemporal description of what happens. In other words, because humans can play games with time. So I came to the same conclusion with Hayek, which is that you need the law to constrain that. So I'm interested in the first principles, which means I'm interested in behavioral economics, which means I'm interested basically in human behavior, and economics is to behavior what physics is to the physical world. And so that's how I look at it as first principles. I actually don't anymore talk almost ever about economics in the macro sense. There's no need to, because it's talked about every day, and it's not the problem. The problem is the disconnect between the policies that are enacted under under 20th century economics and the divergence of those things from the first principles of economics, where the economics of human behavior. And so just like we would say Marx is wrong about human behavior, I would say New Keynesian economics are wrong about human behavior, and that the left and the authoritarians have been able to use this false promise as a means of circumventing human behavior. And you can see this really easily. When we say something, you watch how we say something. We say it as a construction from first principles of behavior. You notice that the Keynesian, New Keynesian said they talk about lines on a graph as if the lines choose things, or if the lines are acting. And while there is some truth to what they're doing, when you confuse this aggregate behavior with the underlying behavior, the first principles, you're actually obscuring that relationship. And so you can get away with all the bad policy we've had.
Also, it's very easy for them to lie using graphs. It's just like it's easy to lie using mathematics.
Correct. So now, to answer your question, the original question, which is the Institute, we originally designed the Institute as a college, not a university, but a college. And the college would teach the natural law and other related courses. We still have the courseware there. I think it's inactive on the site. You can't see it. But we have all the courses listed. What happened, of course, was my illness got worse. COVID, my mother lived a lot longer and COVID happened. And so, and then the world shifted quite a bit, especially recently. So I don't have any different ambition than making these courses across the field. What I have is the realization that we had more work to do on our own science before we could offer those courses. And the way I found that out is when I first tried to teach the work to people, I did it beginning with geometry, and people couldn't understand it. So I view the past 4 years of work, largely with Brad, as shifting how we understand the work so that it can be understood without having really a deep understanding of the foundations of mathematics and its relationship to consciousness. So my plan is to still make the Institute into an educational institution. That doesn't mean we'll succeed. Right now, we're focused on moving from a research and development to an activist organization.
And the next step is teaching the teachers.
Yes, but to get from activism to where we want to be, we have to produce more people. To produce more people requires us to teach them the foundations. Once they have the foundations, they can teach economics from the view of the foundations, right? I mean, and everything else. There's a lot more. We have the full course list. It's a 4-year course list. So, like I say, we plan, but we're a small group of people taking on a heroic scope of work in a time of conflict. So it's not a thing you just kick out overnight like a startup. It's a lot of work. All right, I hope I answered that question.
I just have a couple of things to add. I think in terms of list of authors, I would also add Thomas Sowell to it.
Yes.
Thomas Sowell, who evidently in his youth was what did he call it? Almost a Marxist.
Yes.
And then like his journey to go from that Marxism and feel for everyone to realize, well, actually, in order to actually help everybody, you need to get to the foundations to do what actually works. So his books are worth reading. And the other thing I would say is I taught myself economics in a manner of speaking. In school, I focused on all the engineering disciplines. I didn't give a damn about history and economics. But only because at the time I didn't have the tools and the knowledge to understand the importance of such. When you go from the foundation, when you build from the foundation, whether it's physics or mathematics or whatever, and gradually raising the levels and raising in terms of complexity, eventually I realized, well, for us as a collective of organisms trying to conduct EC in the universe, economics, law, that's our operating system. And if you focus on the first principles, or the way I would call it, if you focus on the mechanisms of how it works, versus, because in modern days in economics, there are a lot of proselytizing. Nations ought to do X. Well, like, what's their condition? If they do X, what are the mechanisms they're going to do it with? And what are the consequences? If you understand the underlying mechanisms of how things work, then you can cut through the BS a lot more easily. And I'll give you an example here, right? One of the economics I follow, who used to be I think he was basically a futures trader in a Chicago mercantile exchange. Made his money there and decided to go take up a teaching post in Beijing or something and start a music club. He wrote a lot about the balance of payments and accounting identities. Accounting identities is one of these things that, yes, it is created by humans just like everything else, but it's how, by definition, you account for investment versus savings and so on between the nations. And if you understand how that mechanism works, then what China does now versus what the United States did in the 1800s, it all starts to make sense. Why they enacted those policies at the time that they have. And what are the consequences of them continuing enacting that policy beyond its usefulness, rather than somebody moralizing and proselytizing, say, well, yes, open trade is good for everyone. No, actually, that's not true. It works in certain circumstances.
It works when there's an asymmetry of a resource in particular. But whenever you're not doing full accounting, there's also transfers occurring, right? Yes. Involuntary transfers going on. So exactly.
I would say that libertarians, maybe Curt would say that means Jewish wing of libertarians, are promising economics free of politics, but the world is never free of politics. You always have friends and enemies.
Actually, what they're always doing, which is really offensive, is they're always trying to profit at the expense of or at the expense of the commons.
Yeah.
And some think there are many true believers who actually think that is the best thing to do.
Well, here's the thing. If them getting paid is hinged on them not seeing certain facts, then of course they're not going to see it.
Yes. So you take a high trust, high commons producing people like Europeans who can do the difference between moral trade and immoral trade, right? So what the Europeans hear is moral free trade. And what the libertarians or the Jewish wing see is immoral free trade. But since they have made their entire culture based on taking advantage of immoral free trade or immoral trade, or what we call largely baiting into hazard, they have created a culture where that's the good thing, right? And I think, Martin, don't you call this as what is it about where we have we say, well, no, this isn't mine. None of us can steal this or do this. And the Jewish or the Semitic is something like, if I don't steal this, someone else will, or something like that.
That was that Israeli guy who was stealing Palestinians' house. He was saying that.
Yes. So, but that's actually the ethical difference between a high trust society and a low trust society. In a high trust society, you do not capital. In other words, you do not privatize the commons, right? You have to, right? Where in a low trust society, you privatize the commons whenever possible. You get yours before somebody else gets it. And so this turns out to be the net result. The net result turns out to be the rate of development, right? Because the rate of development turns out to be the rate of cooperation, turns out to be the rate of advantage, which turns out to be eventually the rate of producing commons, and where commons reduce prices for all, reduce costs for all is a better way of saying it. Whereas low trust polities increase costs for all. So the Marxists tried to circumvent this problem the wrong way. They tried to give people direct compensation, right, and organize it. In other words, redistributists try to give people direct redistribution. The commonsists try to give people indirect contribution. It's the same thing for the Western way of law. We're trying to produce goods by eliminating the bads. The progressives tried to make it, we're going to produce goods directly, and the Marxists went farther. We're saying we're just going to take, we're going to do all the work, force people to into redistributive consequences, and so we're going to avoid the production of doing goods indirectly by suppressing bads. Instead, Marxists institutionalized the production of bads so they could perform direct redistributions. I mean, if you understand that model, it's actually obvious. It's so simple what works and what doesn't. Because when you're doing things indirectly, you're using incentives. And when you're doing things indirectly, you're abusing incentives. So what you get is the Marxist, communist, socialist model is you get attempted to privatize the commons at all times, and you get the maximization of black markets to compensate, and the maximization of corruption markets to compensate. Whereas if you do the opposite, which is you try to suppress black markets, corruption markets, and privatization of the commons, you're playing to incentives to produce those things indirectly. It's really, I mean, I bet I could have said that more cogently and without stuttering so much, because I'm trying to make sure I convert it to accessible language. But I mean, it's really just that simple. Are you playing to incentives, in other words, producing things indirectly, or are you trying to circumvent incentives and produce things directly with negative consequences? So positive externalities versus negative externalities. There's nothing more to it than that. What you're saying is, I acknowledge human incentives, and I want to brute force ignore human incentives. Now, I think I'm trying to be sensitive to Martin's work, is that, but what you get in any circumstance is still human behavior. So what we're fighting against in the current era is that the indirect, like if you go to, I mean, I've done this problem in Russia. I mean, I won't tell the story again, but the corruption is in your face. In America, the corruption is procedural, abstract, right? And it's not even near you. And so,
in a sense, Russia is more democratic that way.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's actually more on it. Corruption it's like violence. violence is more honest than than claims of nonviolence, and corruption is more direct corruption is more honest than indirect corruption. And so the problem in the States is that while we can look over at them and say you could get rid of this transparent corruption by moving it into non-transparent systematic corruption like we have, and so, and my friend Max, he said, well, the difference is that I'm talking when I'm dealing with somebody who's corrupt, it's a negotiation. But when I'm in Russia, when I'm dealing with somebody who's corrupt in America, I can't even find that person, right? I don't even know. It's all process corruption. It's like where Francis and I live in the same area. But what used to bother me was that the amount of fundraising that the police were doing by writing tickets, and so they would basically tax people in one of the most law-abiding cities in America by ticketing them for like going over the white line at a crosswalk, or in my case, not putting my seatbelt on while I drove around a corner from one entry to a parking lot to the other, right? And I get a $700 ticket for that. So I mean, like, that's corruption. It's just procedural corruption, right? Whereas, I was in a shop in Kiev. It's just a restaurant owned by an American. And the guys come in and they try to shake him down for money. He says, fuck off. I'll find out where you are if I have to, right? And they're like, well, this is too much trouble. This guy will create a scene and we'll get exposed, so we're not going to play here. Well, but then again, he's a foreigner and he's got resources, and so he can defend himself. But if you're not a foreigner and you don't have resources and can't defend yourself, the police can shake you down. Like my friends with the strip club, the police would come in and shake them down, and you just view it as paying taxes, right? That's how you view it. You pay the cops to not shake you down, the way we pay, right? And let you get away with your prostitution, right? And if in exchange, so it's just part of doing business. Anyway, that's actually this is going to make a great excerpt, because it's really that simple analysis that helps us understand the macroeconomics of human behavior and how the progressive attempt to force behavior does not work. You got that look on your face, Francis.
I think that last one, that last sentence you said, that's the key.
Yep.
All right. Next question.
Yep.
Question 2. Do you see the election of Trump impacting the work of National Law Institute in any way? Do you think it bought more time for the Institute to prepare to fulfill its objective?
I'm surprised Martin didn't say anything. The right person to answer this is Brandon, because he said it yesterday in an email to me.